Now, in his maiden address to Anglo shareholders last week in London, new Anglo American CEO Mark Cutifani committed the mining giant to South Africa in spite of growing calls in some quarters for it to divest from the country. South Africa's mining sector went through a period of instability last year, and Cutifani's comments can be interpreted as a measure of confidence that the industry has stabilized since. Now, the government and Anglo American Platinum last locked horns when Amplats proposed retrenching about 14,000 workers and shutting 3 of its shafts to restore profitability and take excess platinum off an oversupplied market. As we know, that plan was kicked into touch pending a process which involved a raft of measures to relook the numbers and the profitability of the affected shafts. Now, joining me now to get an update of where the Amplats process stands is the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, Frans Baleni. Frans, thank you so much for coming through to us here on Beyond Markets. Of course, the comments there of Mark Cutifani must have generated some confidence of an extremely volatile, let's say 18 months in the mining sector in South Africa. As one of the big players in the market, Frans, how do you read Mark's sentiments and, you know, your initial reactions to the fact that he seems to be thinking that South Africa is a safe investment for mining at this point?
Good afternoon, Karima, and to the viewers. There is a positive message to our industry, the mining industry. The fact that we have been having reservations that Anglo intends dumping platinum. So that gives us sort of assurance that the new CEO will drive investment into this industry without walking away. So indeed, it's a positive message, and we welcome it. We will actually work with him to ensure that we can direct and deal with the challenges confronting Anglo Platinum as well as the sector in general.
Let's go to Anglo Platinum. Now, of course, we know that there's been a 30-day extension period. We knew that the plans was to initially retrench 14,000 workers. You subsequently met as stakeholders and worked out some kind of measure, but there was uncertainty whether the measure was in fact going to be one that was going to lead to a drastically alternative plan. You've been part of that process. Frans, take us through what the discussions have involved and almost an update of where we are now, particularly in terms of those various task teams that have been set up to relook some of the key issues relating to that restructuring plan.
Well, there were various work streams, but 2 in the main. The one which is looking at productivity, and the one basically looking at the outcome of the internal process by Anglo. Clearly, we must also add that even before looking at the outcome of the work of this work stream, we agreed as major stakeholders or constituency, both ourselves as well as government and other interested parties, that Anglo Platts has not handled this matter very sensitively. It was very clumsily. There was no proper consultation. We think that there's room of redoing the whole exercise. While we were working on these 2 work streams, that the 2 months had expired. That was then extended by 1 month. We are actually positive that in this extension period, we are reaching a sensitive stage of looking at options and alternatives. Our wish as the NUM is to allow the new CEO basically to start the whole game altogether from scratch, to look what work has been done, to look at the work done by the work stream in terms of the tripartite structure, and allow him to apply his mind. We are positive that we should be able to save the jobs. We should be able not to move to this approach of 14,000 in whatever way and manner, but we're quite comfortable that we can save these jobs.
Now, from what you're saying, Frans, would it be correct to say that you're placing quite a lot of hope in the leadership of Mr. Cutifani to bring a new kind of energy to this process? Because the last time that Mr. Griffiths addressed Parliament, he wasn't that certain about whether the process that is currently underway will in fact result in an alternative plan, which is something that I put to the Minister of Minerals, Ms. Susan Shabazz, Mwangu, and she of course took quite a dim view of that. So is there any specific interventions that you know of that Mr. Kutifani is involved in that makes you this confident that the alternatives, or rather the plans that will be put on the table, will be different to that originally put on the table by Anglo Plats?
Look, we just assume that a new set of a pair of eyes should have really a new clean slate, basically. In the first instance, he has now a benefit of the reaction which came out of after the announcement. Secondly, he is now aware of the consequences of retrenching 14,000 economically and socially. And thirdly, that the relationship would have been damaged both in terms of government as well as organized labor. So he would think twice, really, just to embrace that thinking which was there. That's why we think that as a new CEO, he should really start from scratch, apply his mind, given the factors which is now at his disposal, which those who took a decision did not have that benefit.
Now, in terms of the work stream, you mentioned the productivity work stream. Take us through what each work stream is busy with and what the kind of recommendations are that they are beginning to digest, and when we're likely to see them coming up with some kind of indication of what the future, holds for Amplats.
One of the issues around productivity, you look at the capacity of each shaft, you look at personnel, but you look at also management role. For example, supply of machinery, supply of goods, and then you are dealing with the ore body to what extent and the geological challenges which the company might be confronted with. So I don't want to get into the sort of the signals which we are getting, but from where I sit looking at that work, these are things which can be a turnaround. These are things which can be worked on to an extent that the profit loss can be prevented. So bleeding can be stopped. Looking not as a technical person, but as a lay person, I'm quite confident change can be made out of those that work stream. On the other hand, you've got social issues. You've got HR issues, which we think that needs another process, which should result to turning around of attitude, training issues, health and safety issues, which can contribute positively to the profitability of these shafts. The other point which I want to emphasize on the management side, the structuring and the costing basically of this shaft. They have to pay, for example, for the head office in Rustenburg. They have to pay for the head office in South Africa. They have to pay for the London office. So if you can strip all these issues, definitely you would reduce the burden on those shafts.
Now, these work streams are comprised of a series of people that have been chosen by the stakeholders. What are the chances, Frans, in your opinion, of the recommendations that come from these work streams either being embraced or rejected by the stakeholders, given the fact that they have been chosen by all the parties concerned?
We have drawn in expertise from outside. For example, there's an internal independent body which is assisting looking at the productivity challenges. So even if we are there, but that body has better authority insofar as technically this is our assessment. So nobody should be able to dispute it as an independent body. We might not like the outcome, but we should be able to embrace it, that it come independent. If you look at the other areas, we have invited certain aspects to advise us and make recommendation, and those that give us a benefit to be able to mull over all these issues and take a progressive step to prevent job losses.
Now, of course, you were saying now that even if you don't like the outcome, you will have to embrace it because you've placed trust in this technical team. So would it be correct for me to deduce, Frans, that if, for example, this team comes back and says, Anglo was right in the first place, these shafts are not productive, we need to cut job losses, are you, as the National Union of Mine Workers, going to accept that?
We might not accept that. We might say Anglo can sell that shaft. We think another player can make that shaft profitable, because as I said, looking at the work done, it does tell us that can be turned around.
So there are early indications that perhaps Anglo's calculations were not accurate?
Not necessarily. Remember that these large companies have their own set of targets to say, as Anglo, we are promising to make a profit of this magnitude, turn around from our investment. Whereas a small player, 10%, 15% will be fine. Others would expect 30% upwards from the investment. So we think that it's not just an embracing what could come out there, but what is important that do have ideas which can save those jobs. And will these experts say, yes, it makes sense if you bring another small player, that can be possible, and then we can and go along that route.
Now, initially when the restructuring plans were announced, tempers were quite high. There was a lot of noise made about possibly revoking licenses. We've come down from that point of view. From where you're sitting as one of the main players in this process, in the event that Anglo feels that it's not profitable for them, what is the kind of options that you would be putting on the table? Would you be arguing that those shafts that were going to be mothballed, that they be auctioned and that those licenses be rescinded? Will that be something that you put back on the table?
The issue of the license being threatened was the non-compliance by Anglo Platinum. So if that is still, they still take that route of not being compliant, their license will be at risk. But if they are fully compliant, it's merely an issue that the outcome, it is still negative. We would argue strongly, because there's no way we would support a view that 14,000 jobs should go. You're talking of about 244,000 dependents which will be affected. And we're quite confident that other players can run those shafts very profitably. There have been people who have come to us, by the way, various interested parties, which said, looking at from what we have been told, we think that it's possible these shafts can be turned around and be made profitable. And remember this, one of the shafts, which they are not saying they're selling, they're saying they're mothballing it. So that tells you, if you're mothballing it, you are saying that I'm just preserving it, and down the line I can come back because there's value.
Mm-hmm. Final question, quickly, timeframes. When are we likely to hear from all the stakeholders what the way forward is?
Our sense is that by end of April we should have an indication. The latest early May we should have a sense of a conclusion of the work done, because this is very stressful, because those workers want to be free to know that this is behind us and they can work for the future.